As some of you know, I haven't done this for a long time. This is probably the first time I've spoken on the case in about 10 years, actually. I always used to say then, and I say it even more tonight, that I'm not a Dealey Plaza man. I know very little about bullet angles, the kind of profound problems that Tink was talking about have sort of dismayed me from the outset, I guess partly because my limited experience in the Canadian government, foreign services, made me suspicious of all governments. And the way I see the case, which is the politics of the case, is that it is a case which makes us raise questions about our government. So obviously, if you raise questions about your government, you're also going to then have to be skeptical about the evidence which has been protected for all these years by that same government. The reason that I wanted to talk tonight is that I think that in terms of the overall perspective on the case, there has been forward movement. But how many people in this room have read at least something that I have written on this subject? I see, yeah, a lot of you. There have been a couple of books, one by David Scheim, this is the other one, by John Davis, Mafia Kingfish. I guess I didn't bring David Scheim's Contract on America, but half of what I found very difficult to say when I started talking about this 18 years ago is now very easy to say and has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, although it was officially denied by the Warren Commission, namely that organized crime has something to do with this, and specifically had something to do with Jack Ruby. Now, that side of what I said 18 years ago has been so blown out of proportion that I just wanted to say again what it was that I said, first of all, in an unpublished manuscript, The Dallas Conspiracy, in 1970, and then in 1973 in a published article From Dallas to Watergate in Ramparts magazine. I said that, and I think I can be more precise about it now, that whatever happened in this case, it has to do with the intelligence mafia connection in this country. Now you have to remember, this was not acknowledged in 1970 or 73. Not till the Church Committee in 1975 would this government admit that the CIA had worked with the mafia on various projects, and specifically what is most relevant, on the assassination of Fidel Castro. There had been other people who had claimed it, and I argued that the fact of this assassination, and above all that the assassination had been investigated or misinvestigated in the way it had, was a phenomenon attributable to the existence of this intelligence mafia connection, which was symbolized by the involvement with Lee Harvey Oswald with U.S. intelligence, the involvement of Jack Ruby with organized crime, particularly organized crime in first Chicago and then Dallas, and finally the one common denominator in the interests of Oswald and the interests of Ruby, two very different people, but both of them obviously, at least in those last years, interested in Cuba. Now, I sort of come out of retirement on this point because half of what I said then is now being said by a great many people. Ruby was involved with organized crime. Organized crime had something to do with the assassination. And I just want to remind people what I said then is still true, that organized crime could certainly be capable of killing the president, but that what we have seen is a massive cover-up, a cover-up which began in 1963, but which in a sense has never stopped, is an ongoing cover-up. And you cannot, just in terms of the things that you heard this evening, and many more things, some of which I hope to mention, things have happened in the cover-up of this case at the very highest level, which cannot be explained by the agency of organized crime. So I want to keep the case in this perspective that government in this country and in most countries is not what it appears. There is a seamy side to it. It is symbolized by, but not contained by, intelligence mafia collaboration to assassinate the head of a nearby state, Cuba. There are many other activities of that type. Now, in fact, the Dallas, I've watched this whole story evolve. My first manuscript book on this subject, I've had two that have not been published. The first one, The Dallas Conspiracy, I wrote in 1970, and near the end of it, I may have written this in early 71, I focused on the fact that those people who had helped train Cubans originally for the mafia and then the same Cubans taken over by the CIA had very much involved themselves in the, just before and just after the assassination of Kennedy, in the presentation of that case in such a way that virtually forced a government cover-up. And I pointed in particular to a man whom I called in 1970 or 71 Frank Fiorini. He has since become more famous as Frank Sturgis. He was not famous at all in 1971, but it was a matter of concern to me that he was one of a very small group, only about 7 or 8 people, who had been specifically ordered by the Kennedy administration in the last weeks of that administration to cease their own operations against Cuba. And that not only had Frank Fiorini been one of those so named in the New York Times, you can look it up for that year in 1963, but that right after the assassination, he had been part of a concatenated effort to make it look as if Oswald had been run in this case, in this assassination, by Fidel Castro. Sturgis came forward and told the FBI almost immediately that Oswald had been in Miami, something, of course, the Warren report denies. And this sounds innocuous in itself, but very shortly there was a letter arrived, postmarked Cuba, from a man calling himself Pedro Charles, talking about the money he had given Oswald in Miami to kill Kennedy. And that's where what Sturgis did became much more ominous, much more sinister. It was an attempt to pin the case on Castro. There were, may I say, a lot of similar clues. Some of them much more sophisticated, some of them so sophisticated I'm even nervous talking about them, which made it appear that Oswald had done this either for Castro or for the KGB. And it was, I believe, the existence of these very disturbing but false clues which became either the reason or at least the pretext for the U.S. government to say, look, it's better just to say that Oswald acted alone, because we know Hoover on, what was it, November 24th, said we have to get something out right away to make it clear that Oswald acted alone, and Katzenbach drafted a memo the very next afternoon to Bill Moyers saying the same thing, that we have to establish that Oswald was the lone assassin. They did all of this before the Warren Commission had even been conceived of, let alone drawn up, begun its investigations. Well, it was kind of exciting for me to write all of that in not all of that, but the part about Frank Fiorini in 1971, and then see in 1972 that there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee, the Watergate break-in, and one of the people who went inside was Frank Fiorini, now known as Frank Sturgis, always referred to in the papers in those days as one of the Cubans. Press never looked very much at them. They looked at McCord and Howard Hunt and talked about, they would sometimes number them, the 4 Cubans or 5 Cubans or whatever it was. So I wrote my article From Dallas to Watergate, not simply talking about an overlap of personnel, but more specifically saying, and this again was somewhat predictive, I think, in 1973, that the reason that the people, that Watergate was in effect a kind of blackmail of the Nixon administration, and that what these people was doing was very sensitive because of their involvement in previous crimes which had been connected with the U.S. government. That hypothesis was later subscribed to by none other than H.R. Haldeman. After the famous smoking gun tape came out in 1974, the publication of which was followed very quickly by Nixon's resignation rather than go through the agony of an impeachment. And on that smoking gun tape, if you remember, you hear Nixon telling the CIA that they've got to stop the investigation. It's very embarrassing. It involves this Cuba thing, the Bay of Pigs thing, and that the whole Bay of Pigs thing will come out if we don't contain this. And it is Haldeman, not just me, who speculates that what was meant by Nixon when he talked about the Bay of Pigs thing was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. I've already written about this. I don't want to go through it all again. Frank is a bit of a jokester, and he said, A, I had to say something new to you people, and B, I had to do it in 20 minutes. That's going to be different.
Not literally.
All right.
You volunteered, by the way.
If I'm going to say something new, I better say it at the very beginning, because this is a very big case.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. You volunteered this revelatory.
Right, okay. I think that I want to give a couple of new things tonight, because there are so many people here who have read other things I've written. But one new thing I want to offer right away is an enlarged concept of what is going on. I think most people said either Oswald acted alone or there was a conspiracy. And then it seemed so unlikely that there could have been a conspiracy put together that would last all this time that you could impeach the conspiracy alternative and go back to the hypothesis that Oswald acted alone. In 1973, and then in my book, Crime and Cover-Up, which came out in 1977, the subtitle of which was The CIA, the Mafia, and the Dallas-Watergate Connection, was trying to expand beyond the notion of a specific conspiracy to commit a specific crime to the idea that there exists and has, for the whole of this century and more, existed a kind of illicit connection between the forces of organized crime and the forces which govern this country, which made it possible for this crime to have been committed and covered up through the time of Watergate. I was going to say, if we confine ourselves to anything as narrow as a Dallas-Watergate connection, then I would suggest at a minimum that we now, in 1988, have to call that a Dallas-Watergate Iran-Contra connection. Because we see much more clearly than anyone could have in 1977 what is at the center of it that has forced the government into covering up and covering up. Covering up in '63, covering up Watergate, because the real truth of that statement by Nixon, the Bay of Pigs thing, was never aired. Nixon himself pretended that it was just politics, and so he was wrong, he was going to resign. It wasn't just politics. And now finally with Iran-Contra, which was perhaps the most superficial investigation of all. Now, in my book, The Iran-Contra Connection, I argued that we can see very clearly that at the time of the Bay of Pigs, there were two different kinds of people invading Cuba. There were the regular people trained in Guatemala who set sail from Nicaragua and actually came ashore at the Bay of Pigs. Most of those people, they came from all walks of life, but they were what you would call your normal Cubans. But there had been from 1959-60 another group of Cubans, initially financed by the casino owners in Havana, that is to say, by organized crime, and trained initially by Frank Fiorini alias Sturgis, and then taken over by the CIA. But the CIA did not get to recruit them. They had already been recruited by the organized crime people. Is it amazing, therefore, that in the years since we've seen that something like an eighth of all of the people involved in the Bay of Pigs have also been arrested, indicted, or at least investigated by the government for drug trafficking? Because a significant percentage of those people in the Bay of Pigs were the mafia's own people to start with. And some of them, no doubt, had been involved in drug trafficking before the Bay of Pigs, because that's what the casinos in Havana were hotbeds of. I have to say, as a native Montrealer, that back in the late 50s, the two main sources of heroin flowing into the United States were A, Havana, and B, Montreal, and it was the same people often flying from Montreal to Havana and back who were involved in masterminding it in both cases, and this involved the very casinos and their staffs that were then recruited by the mob, taken over by the CIA, and of course continued in their terrorist activities after the Kennedy assassination, at least up until 1967, directly under CIA supervision. The JM Wave station, which was headed by Theodore Shackley, whose name turns up in Iran-Contra, and his assistant Thomas Kleins. That's not new. That is Christic Institute stuff. That's not what I've come to talk about. But you know, I was always interested in something which is now called the World Anti-Communist League, which I had originally researched in connection with how we got into Vietnam. But it rather startled me when I was reading their publications in Taiwan, and they were celebrating all the American reactionaries who came to visit their headquarters in Taiwan, that one of the Americans who came to visit them was an American called Spasti Riken. And I said, hey, I've heard that name before, and I remembered that this was the Traveler's Aid representative who had met Lee Harvey Oswald and his family when they got off the boat in New York. And then I looked at the records of their meetings. They had a regional organization in Latin America, which initially was, above all, Central America. These people very much involved in the Iran-Contra story. And I looked at I got hold, it's very hard to get hold of their conference proceedings, but I got hold of their conference proceedings for 1958. And the chairman of the conference was a man called Antonio Valladares, who had been the crooked lawyer who had fixed Carlos Marcello's phony birth certificate in Guatemala. And one of the people attending it was a man called Maurice B. Gatlin, who was one of these oddballs who hung around 544 Camp Street in New Orleans, which had its own little anti-communist league out of 544 Camp Street. How many people in this room do not know the relevance of 544 Camp Street? There are a few. Well, let me say very quickly, 544 Camp Street was an address that the FBI had a terribly hard time discovering in their investigation, largely because a former FBI agent was running a lot of anti-Castro operations out of that address, including something called the Cuban Revolutionary Council, which was the CIA's Cuban front, which had two branches, one in Miami and another smaller, but I suspect more significant and more sinister in New Orleans. And according to a CIA document, the FBI kept track of all this through Guy Bannister, who was, of course, a former FBI agent. And then the Secret Service, which I think had not been totally clued in on what was happening in New Orleans, They performed very badly in some other cities like Chicago, but in New Orleans they just started investigating Oswald, and they found out here was this pro-Castro guy, Oswald, handing out a fair play for Cuba committee literature with an address stamped on it, 544 Camp Street, which was in fact the address of this anti-Castro operation, the Cuban Revolutionary Council. And not only that, but the Secret Service reported deadpan that there were 5 officers signing for it, one of them being Manuel Gil, who was the production manager for the radio shows of something called INCA, or the Information Council of the Americas, run by a man called Edward Scannell Butler, extremely right-wing, whose main business, I think we can now say, was manufacturing what they called truth tapes, and what some people in this room might want to call lie tapes, for use by the CIA in Latin America. And I know that one of them that they produced, which was interviews with Juanita Castro, Castro's right-wing sister, was used by the CIA to help influence the 1964 election in Chile. So Butler was part of that whole scene and didn't even deny it when I interviewed him for Canadian television back in 1978. I said, you were working with a lot of Cubans who were all financed by the CIA. And he said, well, hell, back in those days, all the Cubans working against Castro were financed by the CIA. This is slightly lost track of in Davis's book. It's a very useful book about Carlos Marcello, Mafia Kingfish, but it disappoints me slightly to see the Frente, or the Council, described merely as being financed by Carlos Marcello. That's probably true. It was financed by most of the big business interests in New Orleans, and Marcello was one of the biggest, but it was also, of course, financed at least in part by the CIA, and I think we should always mention that in the same breath. I was also disappointed, for example, that Davis mentions Marcello as the big mafia person in New Orleans. There were actually 2 big people, according to another book. One was old-time Sicilian mafia, Carlos Marcello. The other was not, who was part of the syndicate, but not Italian at all, was Seymour Weiss, who was a director of Standard Fruit and Steamship, and also a director of the Information Council of the Americas, which staged Oswald's debate. It seems to me that Oswald was, in a sense, quite closely connected to that 544 Camp Street address. And let me just come right up to Iran-Contra, and then I will go back to something new on a factual level, not new to all of you, but new to some of you, about Oswald in New Orleans, and for that matter, in Dallas. I started writing about Iran-Contra in the fall of 1986 because of the involvement of the World Anti-Communist League in the organization, A, of the death squads through all of Latin America, and B, specifically for what became more than just a death squad, the small group of survivors of Somoza's forces who became what are now known the Contras. And I wrote about one wacko, World Anti-Communist League, one wacko person in particular, Mario Sandoval Alarcon in Guatemala, but the godfather of all the death squads in all of Central America, almost certainly one of the people responsible for the shooting of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador, and a man with CIA connections going way back. And I was told back in about 1980 who his CIA contact was, a man called John Martino, M-A-R-T-I-N-O, who, if you want to know more about him, you can look up his name up in Anthony Summers' book, Conspiracy, about the Kennedy assassination, because he is one of that same small group of people who came forward and said that Oswald was in Miami, along with Sturgis and in cooperation with Sturgis. In other words, somebody who was involved with the arrangement of the facts of the Kennedy assassination to induce a cover-up was also a kind of case officer or contact with the man who was the godfather of all the death squads and a key man in putting together the initial Contras before the United States had taken them on, before Reagan had been elected to take them on, before even the Argentinians had taken them on, when they were a very small force indeed, lodged in an apartment house behind Mario Sandoval Alarcon's villa in Guatemala City. I write about this in the Iran-Contra connection, and I write in that same book about this ongoing group of terrorists which takes in the terrorists of Kourou in 1976, a terrible year for Cuban exile terrorism, the year that for example, that Letelier was assassinated in Washington, and the CIA said at first the Chileans couldn't have done it. It had to be left-wingers who needed a martyr. And the director of the CIA himself in 1976, George Bush, was quoted by the Washington Post as saying both of those things. I argued in this book that there was a continuity of terrorism from the Bay of Pigs right through to the present as personified by these Cubans. When I wrote the first draft of it, it was before the Hassenfuss plane had gone down, and I was just amazed to see in the spate of stories that after that Hassenfuss plane came down, first of all, that there was an Ilopango air base I hadn't known about when I wrote my article, and it turned out there were 3 of my Cubans at that Air Force base. All of them assassins, all 3 assassins. The chief one there, Felix Rodriguez, the man who oversaw the assassination of Che Guevara, had been put there by the office of Vice President Bush. And he collected 2 more. He collected Luis Posada Carriles, whom I'd already written about, but had no idea he was actually part of the Iran-Contra support operation. And the 3rd man, Rafael Quintero, perhaps the most professional assassin of them all, the man whom Ed Wilson contacted when he wanted to assassinate somebody on behalf of Gaddafi in Libya. So you had a support operation of 3 Cubans who had 2 common denominators. One, they had all worked for the CIA in the past, and second, their specialty had not been loading things on airplanes. Their specialty had been assassination. Now, there are people who say that just shows that the Contras are death squads. But I don't think it's that. I think it's really that Felix Rodriguez is in the position to ask the government for a favor, and particularly to ask the man who was director of the CIA in 1976 for a favor, because if the truth of what happened in 1976 were to come out in 1989, we would have Bushgate. We would have Bushgate. And particularly interesting is the fact that Posada was in a Venezuelan jail and was sprung after Rodriguez was ensconced at Ilopango, a base that you and I cannot visit, a secret base. It was arranged from Miami that Posada should be sprung from his jail in Venezuela. It cost quite a lot of money, I understand. And he then knew exactly what to do. He went straight to Ilopango, and this fugitive for justice worked for the next 1.5 years as part of the Iran-Contra operation. And then when the shit hit the fan in 1986, he then apparently went to Miami, a safer place still for him. And a lot of people speculate that he is still there, or at least can be there when he wishes to be, because the Ed Meese period of the Justice Department made it very clear that they didn't want certain things coming out about Iran-Contra. Above all, not things having to do with Cubans in Miami who had had anything to do with the Contra support operation. And I saw some more names in those news stories after I'd already written my article, names of people who knew about the Cubans who had gone from Miami to be part of the Contra support operation in Costa Rica. And by golly, there were names of Cubans from the FBI files, unpublished, on the Kennedy assassination, including at least one Cuban who had been at that mob-connected training camp on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain, which Carlos Brangue, a DRE anti-Castro Cuban, member of the Cuban Revolutionary Council at 544 Camp Street, had initially thought that Lee Harvey Oswald was trying to infiltrate on behalf of the FBI. A very interesting notion that I want to come back to and take rather seriously. So when I say there's a Dallas-Watergate, Iran-Contra connection, I'm saying it from the personal experience of trying to keep up with events and describing the past event by using names of people who are going to turn up in the next event. We are not talking about a cast of tens of thousands here. We are talking about a specific group of people who, if they had been involved with the Kennedy assassination in 1963, would have been too numerous to kill all of them, although some, I think, did get killed, and who have been able to lean on the people running this country ever since. Now, you have another hypothesis for what's happening, which is larger than that and is, I think, largely true. The hypothesis of Scheim in Contract on America, or to some extent of Davis in his new book, Mafia Kingfish, which we have run through a period in which both Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon were themselves politically beholden to the forces of organized crime which helped elect them. And if we don't exaggerate this, I think it's true. We shouldn't leave John F. Kennedy out of that list either. It isn't just that his family had made their money out of bootlegging. It isn't just that John F. Kennedy was enjoying the favors of at least two beautiful women, one of them very famous, who had been supplied to him really by the graces of organized crime. It was that organized crime had helped elect Kennedy in 1960 and had expected certain favors in particular. One man in particular, Skinny D'Amato, a close friend of Kennedy's father and a mobster, complained that he had helped deliver the state of New Jersey for Kennedy in 1960, and they had understood that in exchange, a few people would be quietly pardoned a couple of 2 years later. Joe Kennedy saw nothing wrong. John Kennedy said, "I'll give it to Bobby." And Bobby Kennedy, of course, had started his war on organized crime, and these people never got pardoned. And Skinny D'Amato, a personal friend of Marilyn Monroe and Judith Exner, felt that the mob had been not just let down, but in a sense betrayed by Kennedy. That's a much larger hypothesis that is also relevant, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that there has been a smaller operational involvement of a specific group of people in the assassination area with the U.S. government, which up until about 13 years ago we didn't even officially know was in the assassination business, and that has generated a great deal of clout to engender yet new adventures of the Contra type. Because what are you going to do with these people if you don't keep them employed at places like Ilopango? They could make life very unpleasant for you. Now, I just want to say one more thing and then open it up to questions. And that is what I think the chief thing wrong with the Scheim book and the Davis book when they come to deal with Oswald in New Orleans. I could say quite a lot, but I want to focus on one figure in particular, David Ferry. Because David Ferry, as you know, is the man who took this extraordinary trip to Texas, and while he was away, his normal employer, Jack Martin, who shared offices with Guy Bannister at 544 Camp Street, went to the, was it the New Orleans Police or to the New Orleans District Attorney?
Police
or both?
first.
Police first. And said, check out David Ferry. And very soon there was a rumor that Lee Harvey Oswald had been arrested with David Ferry's library card. And this must have got to a high enough level to explain why Marina Oswald, when she was being held in virtual isolation in the Inn of Six Flags, one of my favorite stories, which would take too long to talk about here, the FBI couldn't find her, but there was the Secret Service asking her if she had ever heard of a Mr. Ferry. And she answered no. Ferry became, at that time, a hot suspect for a possible conspiracy, and then J. Edgar Hoover decided as soon as Oswald was dead that no, Oswald had done it alone, and interest in Ferry subsided. And both Schein and Davis assumed that if there was an organized crime conspiracy and Marcello had something to do with it, then Ferry must be a very important part of that. So, of course, did Blakey. But it was very obvious, Blakey, the author of this report of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, it was very obvious that Robert Blakey did not want to see CIA in this business. He did want to see organized crime, and I won't go through the various sort of maneuverings and manipulations that Blakey had to do to arrive at that result. I want to offer to you an opposite hypothesis, and that is that Ferry was sent on that Wild Goose case as a decoy to be sure that if there ever was a second investigation of the assassination, it could be initiated in Louisiana, in an area where organized crime had altogether more clout than it had in most parts of the United States, and in which the investigation could be at a minimum controlled to stay out of certain areas. I think that I want you to think about that, and I want to draw attention to one characterization of Ferry by Davis, which is tiny in itself, but I think indicative of a kind of superficiality that we have to look through. Davis says categorically of David Ferry, first, that he was bizarre. Almost everyone talking about Ferry says he was bizarre and starts talking about his baldness. And then Davis adds that he was, and he says deadpan, a bishop of the Orthodox Old Catholic Church of North America. Now, there's no excuse for saying that in 1988 as if it was just a fact by itself. Yes, he was, but we know why he was. The House Committee revealed it. The Treasury Department and the Small Business Administration was interested in investigating phony churches that sold phony bishoprics. So they hired an investigator to look into how these things were done. And they hired Jack Martin. And Jack Martin said, well, we'll have to see how easy it is to buy a bishopric. He hired David Ferry to get a bishopric as part of an investigation that was concluded before the Kennedy assassination. And we learned from the House Committee records that there is actually a small business SBA hearing on this matter in which Martin's and Ferry's results were entered. Now, the reason I draw attention to that detail and how you have to look at the fact that Ferry could do something like become a bishop in order to fulfill somebody else's agenda to conduct an investigation. There was a lot of investigation run out of 544 Camp Street. I just want you to consider the hypothesis that Lee Harvey Oswald also was being hired as an investigator to conduct similar investigations. Let's take, I think, the simplest and most obvious and suggestive example of all, his buying of a gun, mail order, in Dallas in early 1963 under the pseudonym A.J. Hadell. And of course, as if he didn't think J. Edgar Hoover was very bright, he was careful to have the A.J. Hadell alias in his wallet when he fired the magic bullet at Kennedy and Connally to make sure that the FBI would be able to put two and two together here. Let's consider the hypothesis. First of all, if Oswald just wanted to shoot the president, the easy thing to do in Dallas is to go into a store and buy a gun. It's also the safer thing to do if you don't want to get caught. But Oswald insisted on getting his rifle and his pistol in such a way that there would be a documentary record of it. So he ordered them by mail order across a state boundary and happened, one way or another, to pick on two different agencies. Help me, Paul. Seaport Trading and what's
Klein Sporting Goods.
Our sponsor tonight.
Klein
Sporting Goods, our sponsor tonight.
Which were under investigation at the time to see if, in fact, they were selling guns in an unauthorized way across state borders without requiring identification. And I believe, I haven't checked my notes on this, that there was, I could if anyone's interested, that there was a hearing on this chaired by Senator Dodd in 1963, was it, Paul? Paul has done great work on this and knows more about it than me. And in the hearings that were ultimately held, there was a chart in which you can pick out the pistol that went from Los Angeles to Dallas, namely Oswald's pistol, part of the evidence introduced into the hearing. Now let's come back to New Orleans for a moment. Both the CIA and the FBI had been told to target the FPCC, the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. This is why it is so extraordinary that it was the FBI which had been told to target the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was not able to link the 544 Camp Street address to Oswald except through David Ferry. There's much that could be said about that, but I just want to confine myself to the hypothesis. If you want to find that anyone in New Orleans who's interested in helping Castro, somebody like Guy Bannister from his anti-Castro headquarters at 544 Camp Street engages somebody to act like a Fair Play for Cuba Committee organizer, and who then in effect becomes a vacuum cleaner to scour the boards for any Castro sympathizers. This is why it's particularly important that Oswald's first leafleting operation that we know is out at a U.S. Navy ship, because the U.S. Navy would really have wanted to know this. Also, Oswald celebrated leafleting in front of the International Trade Mart that was watched by most of the anti-Castro activists in New Orleans, including a lot of people on a very high public relations level. Oswald did not leaflet there alone. He seems to have had two assistants. One of them was run down by the Warren Commission. This man, Charles Hall Steele, testified that he had leafleted for about 15 minutes. This is about the length of time that the TV cameras were turned on. Now, those of you in Berkeley who have ever tried to organize anything and to get the television there, you know it's not all that easy. And to arrange the timing so that you can just do it for 15 minutes while the TV cameras are turned on and then stop. For us in Berkeley, the TV stations are not so cooperative. I think it certainly looks as if Oswald's leafleting in front of the International Trade Mart was staged for television, and it certainly became very relevant after the assassination. It may or may not have been part of the legend that was being created for Oswald. But I don't agree with Carlos Brangue about very much, but Brangue really was involved with that training camp, and it took us years to find out that training camp really was largely a DRE training camp, and Brangue was DRE, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil. Most people didn't know that in 1963. If Oswald was a loner, he certainly couldn't have known it. He had to be working for somebody. What Brangue suggested to the Warren Commission was that Oswald was working for Fidel Castro. But none of us believed that. The other possibility, which is what Brangue originally believed and told the New York Times he had originally believed, Oswald was working for the FBI. There's one other reason to think that this is a credible hypothesis. There are witnesses to how Oswald came into these Cubans, and two of them say that he talked about something called Cosa Nostra, or one of them, even more interestingly, said Casa Nostra. This is sworn testimony before the Warren Commission about a meeting that took place between Oswald and these right-wing Cubans in August of 1963. Now, we all know today what Cosa Nostra is supposed to mean. Nobody knew this in August 63 except A, Cosa Nostra itself, and B, the FBI, which from the beginning of 1963 had been electronically wiretapping the Cosa Nostra for the first time. It became part of the American vocabulary in September 1963 when Joe Valachi spilled his guts to a Senate committee. In August 63, you had the FBI sending out messages to its stations, stop talking about Causa Nostra. We now know it's Cosa Nostra. And here is Lee Harvey Oswald coming into these Cubans and talking about Casa Nostra. It doesn't prove it, but if I had time, I would take every single event in Oswald's life from early 1963, above all the Odio incident, which looks very much like an investigation of gun running by Alpha 66 in Dallas, which a Dallas sheriff identified Oswald as having frequented, one of those dropped pieces of evidence. Alpha 66 being also part of the World Anti-Communist League, the only Cuban group that is. I think a working hypothesis that will explain a good deal of what Lee Harvey Oswald did is that he was investigating for the U.S. government. We have Brangue believing this in 63. We have Marina Oswald saying in 1988 for the first time that she believed that her husband was doing some kind of work for the U.S. government. It is not a totally tidy hypothesis, but I think it is the most efficient hypothesis for explaining A, what Oswald was doing in that era, and B, why we have had such an industrious cover-up of the assassination ever since.